We are in the middle of chapter 12 in the Tzemach Tzedek's Mitzvos Hamanas Alikus discourse in his book Derech Mitzvosecha. We are still talking about the nature of time. And really, we've been explaining how with regards to time, there's three general types. There's time itself, as we experience it. There's something called Seder Hazman, the order of time, which exists above time, as we experience it, and is the source of time. And then there is God Himself, who is truly beyond time.
Amen. Good note.
We explained last time that all time really originally derives from what's called the mati v'lo mati in the world of akudim. That initially there is an initial dualism, there is an initial split in the single emanation that consists of the world of akudim, where all of the sfirot are bound together as one, and everything is contained there in one single unity. In that expression, there is mati v'lo mati. There is its tendency towards being, or a different way of saying it is there is God's tendency towards desiring creation. And then there is the inherent instability of that desire. That desire is in conflict with God's essential being, which is beyond any desire, for worlds. And so in the world of akudim, in that initial expression at the beginning of the Kav, as we've been describing it, you have both aspects as one. In that one expression, you have the desire for the world and the inability to desire the world. And in this one desire, they both exist, so to speak, in tension. There are two facets. That initial dynamic between desiring and not desiring, between mati and lo mati, is the source really of all multiplicity, because the 10 spheres which are eventually unpacked and emanated individually from that initial expression are emanated according to the nature of that mati v'lo mati, of that desire and lack of desire. This is really what creates later splits between light and vessels, and the individual nature of each sphera, and the individual nature of each sphera is what goes on to give everything in the world its nature, and combinations of the spheres. And we were explaining that time follows this process, that time initially starts as one expression in the world of akudim, in the world of Adam Kadmon, and there everything is seen b'skira achas. This is what it says, that when God looks at the creation, He sees everything in one glance, right? Everything, the creation exists all at the same time. You can see it in one glance because there, time is only divided by this single dynamic, a single mati v'lo mati. But as the spiritual worlds unfold and go lower, the time becomes more and more divided. So what is initially one single expression which contains everything, past, present, and future, the physical universe and all the spiritual worlds, all as one, that is actually unpacked and is given more, I guess what you would call distance. The time is given more distance, one time from the other. So you have, until eventually, through the descent of the world and through the dividing and subdividing of the godly expression and the spheres interacting with each other, you get the expressions for a whole millennium, and then you get an expression for a year, an expression for a month, an expression for a day, for the 12 hours of the day, and for a moment. And each individual moment is an expression. The fact that the moment follows one after the other is reflective of the fact that it's of the individual divine energy, the individual spheres and partsufim the arrangements of the spheres and the arrangements of godly energy, or the divine letters, whatever you want to call them, that give life to that time, they basically create the passage of time. The actual passage of time, as we experience it, reflects this unfolding process. And this was the answer to the question of how the entire year can be emanated at once on Rosh Hashanah, how you can have a whole year of time in one day. And the explanation is that the time initially comes in larger amounts. It's only through the process of ishtalshelus, through the process of division and subdivision, further and further, that the emanation of a year is split up into smaller emanations and more precise emanations of godliness, and that eventually goes on to create each moment. So when we say that a year is in a day, we don't mean in time as we have it now in the actual physical universe, the actual passage of time with which we are aware. We mean that the source of the time for the whole year is emanated all at once on Rosh Hashanah. We explained that time, this is where we finished. We said that really, the question is how far up does our concept of time go? Up the ladder of the spiritual worlds? How far up the chain does actual time go before it switches to the source of time, where there isn't any real conception of time? And the Tzemach Tzedek told us on page 372 that it goes up essentially to Malchus of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. So the last Sefira of the lower three worlds and below is the place where there is an actual passage of time. Above that, you have only the order of time. And that's why we say about Hashem, Melech, Molach, Yimlech. He is king, was king, and will be king, because the entire idea of calling God a king is inherently, kingship is what is called in Kabbalah, is the name in Kabbalah for the relationship that God has specifically, as God stands specifically in relation to that which is much lower than him, because as it says, Ein melech b'loi am, there's no king without subjects, there's no king without a people. And so really, when God is a king, this implies that if God is a king, there must be worlds. Worlds to the level of God where he is a king, to that aspect of godliness where he actually rules, there must be something over which he rules. And that is the Sfira of Malchus, the aspect of godliness which is actually associated with the world. And the Tzemach Tzedek points out that that's why we say he is king, was king, and will be king. Because the time applies, God is within time inasmuch as he's expressing himself in Malchus, inasmuch as he's expressing himself in this low way that he actually rules over the world. So inasmuch as God in his expression stands in relationship to the world, he is within time. And that's actually when we say he's eternal in the common sense, that he always was, he is, and he always will be. As opposed to what we normally say about God, which is that he stands entirely outside of time. Right? So that's why we say about Hashem, Melech, Malach, Yimlech. We mean that Malchus, his kingship, is the aspect in which he is within time, or has a relationship with time.
But it says, Adon Olam Asher Malach, B'terem Kol Yitzim Nivad, before anything was created.
It's a different issue, unrelated, more or less. Chaim. In the Chassidic explanation, it's an unrelated issue.
How so?
Because it's really about the definition of melech rather than time, which is not what we're talking about. So let's start in the last line of page 372. Yes? Nevertheless, umikol makim hu gam ken. Are you with me? Nevertheless, hu gamken, even this, meaning even time as it actually exists, even actual time as we perceive it, not the spiritual source of time which exists beyond Malchus, beyond God as he expresses himself as a king in relation to the world. Even actual time in the differences between the worlds also exists in a way of general and specific, as we've been explaining. Ki bebiyah, because in the worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, in the lower three of the spiritual worlds, ein tzarich le'eschalek hashefa l'chalakim kol kach. The godly expression, the godly influence does not have to be divided to the same extent kamei be'elam hashafal shalanu, as it does in the lowest world of ours. Generally speaking, this is the rule. If you haven't seen the principle so far, I was actually explaining it to someone last night, that it's almost a little bit like a pyramid, if you think of it very simply, right? Absolute unity and absolute infinitude belongs to God alone, right? The world is a place of nearly infinite or infinite multiplicity. There's an infinite number of things in the world. And in between, you have various spiritual worlds where there's a certain number of things. Like, for example, there's 10 spheres, right? So you go from 1 to 10 to an uncountable number of things and aspects and divisions and all of these things. And generally speaking, because our world is created, as you must always remember when studying Chassidus, because our world is created with the intention of being what is called a tachton, of being the lowest possible world in which God can still be expressed, therefore, our world is a world of multiplicity. And as you get closer in the process of creation to our world, things become more and more multiplicitous. It is the way of the concealment of God, which creates our world, that the more God is concealed, the more division and plurality there is. That's why, as an aside, when we say God creates the world, right, if you read the first chapter of Bereshis, the name Havaya, the four-letter name of Hashem, is never mentioned. It says, Bereshis bara Elokim. Elokim creates the world. And as it says often in Chassidus, when it talks about God's name, Elokim, what does Elokim denote? Elokim is in the plural form. Elokim actually means, if you were translating literally, it would mean gods, not God. Right, which you'd think in Judaism would be a big no-no, right? So it refers to God alone, and in fact there are even cases in the Tanakh where it clearly refers to God alone, and it's still conjugated in the plural. It says Elokim Kadoshim, referring to God, if I'm not mistaken, in at least one place. So Elokim, which is the name of the one God, is in the plural form. What does this mean? What does this mean to indicate? It means that as God creates the world, and as God relates to creation, He introduces multiplicity. Shem Elokim, which in Kabbalah corresponds to Tzimtzum, the concealment of God. Gvura, His severity, God hides Himself from the creation, that automatically brings out plurality, multiplicity. There's more than one. So when God is hiding Himself, hiding His, so to speak, His true nature, you see multiplicity. And therefore, Shem Elokim is in the plural form. So this is the general rule. So when we're saying in our mimer that the higher spiritual worlds, and when we say higher, we mean relatively not much higher. Bria and Yetzirah are the two middle spiritual worlds, where we still say there is an actual concept of time, a real time, as we have in our world. In Bria and Yetzirah, the time still doesn't need to be as divided as it is in our world. The truest multiplicity, the furthest extent of multiplicity and plurality is in our world. As you go higher and as you go more spiritual, things are more unified, which is really an old philosophical point, right? I've brought it up in this class before. In fact, it's one of the differences between the spiritual and the physical, right? How many Pythagorean theorems are there? Right? Wow. Triangles, there's many. Triangles that operate according to the Pythagorean theorem, there's many. But the Pythagorean theorem is one. Right? In general, as you get more spiritual, as you get more abstracted, you become more unified. Our world is an exceptionally divided place. It's so divided that things that are the same expression of the same triangle, can actually be multiplicitous and in different places. You can have carbon copies, like a factory. right? A factory makes the same thing over and over and over again. The fact that you can have the exact same cell phone, for example, that has the exact same capacities and is made pretty much exactly the same, and all that really divides them is the matter of which they're made and the space and time which they occupy, is an incredible, in the perspective of Chassidus, in the perspective of someone who is pursuing spiritual pursuits, is an incredible lowness. It's actually a lie, is really what it is. It's duplicitous, right? You have two iPhones, but nothing real differentiates between them. The only thing that differentiates between them is technicality. One iPhone is here, and the other iPhone is here. Technically, they're in different places, but in a pnimiusdik way, in an inner way, there's nothing really different between them. Right? It's almost a lie. It's a falsehood of physicality, is one way of looking at it. Right? This is a very old idea. So, as you go more spiritual, the differences between things become more substantial, right? The Pythagorean theorem, the truth of it, there's only one. And if you want to have something else in math, it has to be defined differently. It has to have an inner difference. Because of its nature, it doesn't occupy the same spiritual space, right? As opposed to the technicality of physical differences, right? All of which is to say that the true multiplicity and division, to the point where things are divided beyond even their nature, is in our world. As you go higher, things become more unified, which is what the Tzemach Tzedek is saying here. And he says it applies to time as well. As he explains further on the third line of 375, V'nimtza b'china achas debiyah one unit in Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, the spiritual worlds, can include within it many, many of the units of our lowest physical world. V'lechein, therefore, b'skira achas, in one glance, yuchulu asara eitazvav shanim, is included 10 or 15 years. Umezem, move on, says the Tzemach Tzedek. From this is understood, this is very unusual for a mimer, Hamaisa the Baal Shem Tov, the story of the Baal Shem Tov, Shetzafa v'hisig b'Rosh Hashanah ma shahaya achar, that he saw and grasped on Rosh Hashanah what would happen afterwards. Ki yedua hamaisa shel gisei Rav Gershon Kituver im hachacham be'eretz hakodesh, as is known the story of his brother-in-law Rav Gershon Kituver with the chacham, with the sage from Eretz Yisrael. It's a long story, and I don't remember all the details. It has to do with his brother-in-law got in trouble with the religious authorities in Eretz Yisrael, and the Baal Shem Tov sent him a letter. He was put into Cherem, I believe. One of them put the other one in Cherem. It was a whole thing. One of them excommunicated the other. It was a whole debacle. And the Baal Shem Tov wrote him a letter that arrived him on the day that he was put in Cherem, talking about that, and it arrived him on that day talking about what would happen with the whole story, the whole situation. So the Baal Shem Tov obviously had to have written it earlier. He wrote it on after Rosh Hashanah when he saw what was going to happen, and he sent a letter to his brother-in-law. Shekasav le'ah Baal Shem Tov kol ha'maisa, the Baal Shem Tov wrote him the entire story, terem shehayasa b'feil, before it actually took place. So how did this work? The Tzemach Tzedek is not bringing a story for no reason. He's saying something very specific.
How does it know until what world is the Shama when?
This is known. V'hagam shaloi hayasa aliyas nishmasai b'chlal hakadum da'ak hanal. Even though the Baal Shem Tov's soul did not ascend, this is what Tzemach Tzedek is saying, to the level of, to the general light, the general primordial light of Adam Kadmon, right, which you were just describing before, of Akudim, where everything is included in one glance. I'm going to finish talking about reading it, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. Ela be'hechalos de Yetzirah, the soul of the Baal Shem Tov only reached the hechalos of Yetzirah, the chambers of the world of Yetzirah, the second lowest of the spiritual worlds. Mikol Makim, nevertheless, Hare Gam Sham, even there, Yuchal Liyos Nichlalim Tesvav Shanim Beskira Achas Kanal. Even there, 15 years can be included in one glance, as we were speaking about before. So, in other words, the Baal Shem Tov did not have to ascend to the level of Adam Kadmon, which includes all of the time in history at one glance. He only ascended to the level of Yetzirah. Yetzirah is one of the spiritual worlds where there's actually time. It's not from the order of time. It's actually within the time of our world. Time prevails there. There is such a thing as time. But there, things are not as divided as we were saying before. Things are more unified. And in the world of Yetzirah, he could see 15 years all at once, all as a unity. And he saw what would happen to his brother-in-law there. We're obviously discussing a form of mystical union, or what may otherwise be called a form of nevuah, or ruach hakodesh, some sort of prophecy or insight into the Holy Spirit. And we're saying that his soul ascended to that level. I suppose we should talk about this for a moment. Generally speaking, it talks in Chassidus about the different levels of different people's souls. Now, it explains in Tanya that all souls come from the world of Atzilus. They're initially emanated in the world of Atzilus, the highest of the four spiritual worlds. But they go through a process almost like a centrifuge of differentiation. Some souls, very few, come down to our world from Atzilus direct, so to speak, without going through any further subdivisions or any further dilutions on the way down. Other souls more commonly pass down through all of the intervening worlds and go through many, many different levels as they come into this world. And they express, therefore, in a lower way, even though their source is in the world of Atzilus. Now, with regards to prophecy, there's a large body of Kabbalah and Chassidus about the nature of prophecy and the different prophetic visions of different sages in Jewish history and their abilities and all of these things. Generally speaking, I believe we say that even Moshe Rabbeinu's experience, which is the greatest prophecy that will ever be, as it says in the Chumash, his prophetic experience, the unity of his soul with God, was really at the level of Yesod Abba, what's called Yesod Abba of Atzilus. There's a certain level in the world of Atzilus. So the question is, we have been speaking over the past few weeks of worlds that are even above Atzilus, right? The Tzemach Tzedek seems to know about all sorts of things that are above the world of Atzilus. We have the world of Akudim, we have the world of Nekudim, right? We have Ora Ein Sof, we have the Tzimtzum, we have all the things we talk about in our class. So does the Tzemach Tzedek have greater prophecy than Moshe Rabbeinu? Right? Or the Tzemach Tzedek got these terms and this information from the Arizal, perhaps. So do we say that the Arizal had greater prophecy than Moshe Rabbeinu? And the answer is no. The answer is no. The difference is that there is something called prophecy, which is a unity of the soul with God, by which the soul receives knowledge imparted by God at different levels. And there is something called chachma, called wisdom. Wisdom and prophecy are not the same thing. They have their advantages and they have their disadvantage. Each one has an advantage. The advantage of prophecy should be obvious.
Wait.
Yeah.
Why would you even juxtapose advantages and disadvantages of wisdom and prophecy?
Why?
Because they're two different things.
They're entirely two different things.
So why?
Because they're both revelations of God to man in different ways, using two different modes. There's a prophetic mode in which God reveals himself to man, and there's a mode through wisdom where he reveals himself to man.
Okay, but that's easy enough to follow. So why would you, in what context would you say something has an advantage and a disadvantage? Why would we want to know that?
In terms of the knowledge of God, greater knowledge of God. Should I pursue being a prophet or a chacham if I want to know God?
Oh, okay. So in other words, someone,
Yeah.
mere mortal,
Yeah.
mere mortal says, I'm thinking about becoming a prophet.
Maybe back in the day.
I'm thinking about becoming.
That's really a theoretical, but yeah.
Okay, but
I just explained it to you. There's prophets that reached certain levels of godly expression. They reached a certain level of insight. But there are certain sages with wisdom who knew things that the prophets didn't seem to know. And the question is, what does that mean?
No, I
understand?
Go back to your advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah.
Because that's how you frame this.
Yeah. I don't understand.
So, if you said to somebody, young person, what are you thinking about doing the rest of your life?
Yeah.
One answer, possible categories. Prophet.
Okay.
Sage.
All right.
Business person.
Right.
Or something.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you can say, okay, well, as career paths, here are your advantages and disadvantages. Because we understand advantages and disadvantages, I guess in a material way. But maybe I'm missing what you're trying to say about advantages and disadvantages.
Well, if you let me explain what the advantages and disadvantages are, maybe it would be clear.
Okay.
The advantage of the prophet, which should be relatively obvious. When I say wisdom, I mean Torah wisdom, right? When we say a Torah sage, when you say a chacham in Judaism, a Talmud chacham, you mean someone that studies the Torah. Now, it's true that the Torah is initially a prophetic vision, but set that aside at the moment. It's true, the Torah does come through prophecy, but once the Torah initially comes through prophecy, it's then given over to wisdom, right? In the oral Torah and in all the explanations and all these different things, yes? So, the advantage of prophecy over wisdom is that prophecy is a direct engagement in a revealed way of the soul with God. It is a communion with God in a revealed and obvious way. Is prophecy. Prophecy is you should believe me when I tell you, says Moshe Rabbeinu, about Yesod Abba Vatzilus, because I've been there, right? I directly experienced it. I know it intimately. I know it like my own hand. I experience it. This is my soul directly experiences these things. The advantage of prophecy is that it's direct experience. Can't argue with direct experience. Direct experience gives profound insight that reading about somewhere, you can read about Paris all day, but someone who's been there 5 minutes knows more about Paris than someone who's learned about it their whole life in certain ways, right? Wisdom, learning about God through Torah, which is a different mode of divine expression, actually reaches higher. In fact, anybody has the capacity to learn about different levels of God.
But it's a deduction, you might be mistaken.
With less and greater insight. Yeah, sure. There's all sorts of pitfalls. There's plenty of pitfalls on the road to prophecy as well. But the advantage of scholarly knowledge is that because it is not limited to what you can directly experience, in other words, what your soul merits to experience in that direct way, you are able to know things higher and beyond what the prophet can directly experience. So just like you can, to use a very, very coarse metaphor, just like you can, because you read about Paris for years, you know about places in Paris that the person who visits for a week can't possibly get to because you know about more places than a person can visit in a week. So in a way, the sage, the person who studies, the person who learns, knows more. But he doesn't know it directly in first-hand experience. So the advantage of prophecy is direct experience. The advantage of wisdom is that because it is not limited to direct experience, you can in a way know more. So the sages that followed after Moshe, who talk about levels beyond Yesod Abba, are talking from a position of Chachma. They're talking about what they have derived from their Torah learning, both the oral Torah and the Kabbalah and the written Torah, and this is all wisdom derived from Torah. So when they speak of it, they are not speaking of direct experience. The highest direct experience outside of Torah that any neshama has had in a revealed way, so to speak, of a revelation of God, is Yesod Abba Vatzilus, which Moshe Rabbeinu experienced in his prophecy. That's that. So that's that idea. So when we say here, the Baal Shem Tov had a certain insight into Yetzirah. second lowest, of the second lowest, of the spiritual worlds, higher only than Asiya, we mean, bepashtus, I assume, we mean that he had direct experience. And because he had direct experience of that, because his soul merited to have that expression of God revealed to him, he had an insight into time. He ascended, so to speak, not above time itself, but beyond the worldly division of time, where one moment must follow after another. And in the world of Yetzirah, 15 years can be contained in the time that he was there, and he saw what would happen with his brother-in-law.
Are you describing this for gifts? You're not
Correct.
I'm sort of quibbling with the word advantage. So if you say there's a difference between having the gift of prophecy,
yeah,
and the earned, and having the capacity to earn, having the gift of the capacity to earn, to learn knowledge. So one is a gift, one gives you a capacity to do something. The other
Gives you a capacity to do something.
well, the other is more innate, but they're both gifts.
I think they both have aspects of a gift, and they both have aspects of working on
It was
them.
advantage that was sort of throwing me.
Why?
Because I didn't normally speak that way. If you have to say, Ronnie here has the gift of being able to put something on paper that's artistic. That's a gift. Larry here is a great basketball player.
Right, and there's advantages and disadvantages to being an artist and a basketball player.
But they're two different things. I wouldn't compare, because you can't compare those things. They're just different. They're just different.
But these are two things
Brings
down God.
Yeah, if they were related in some endeavor, for example, if they were related in some endeavor, such as having a profession, there'd be advantages and disadvantages.
That's right.
Sure. So here, the endeavor is the revelation of God.
The word advantage, maybe
The prophet has an insight. Has insight into lower expressions of godliness, but his insight is more direct. And the sage has insight into higher levels, higher expressions of godliness, but his insight is more in the manner of someone who's learning about it, rather than someone who's directly experiencing what he's learning about. You can call that whatever you like.
Right?
Yeah.
And they say that the Meyaldot in Egypt,
Yeah.
they were prophets. They saw, a lot of things being born.
Mm-hmm. You're saying so they were above time is what the connection you're drawing. V'lechen, the second line on page 374. Therefore, just as the Baal Shem Tov could ascend to the world of Yetzirah and see 15 years at a glance, so to speak, but on Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, shenimshach beichelek hachayos al kol hashana, where part of the life force, the portion of the life force for the entire year is drawn down. Shelechein nikra rosh, which is why it's called the head. That's why it's called the head of the year and not the beginning of the year. Very famous vort in Chassidus. Kashem sha'arosh kol al chayos kol aguf, because just as the head, generally speaking, contains the life force for the entire body, and in general the body is directed by the head, the body lives for the head. So too does Rosh Hashanah contain the entire year at one glance. So just as Yetzirah has 15 years all at once, so too Rosh Hashanah has a year all at once. Right, what is drawn forth on Rosh Hashanah is a year all at once. So too it is with Rosh Chodesh, the first day of the month, for the entire month. This is the secret implied by what the sages say. That this is a midrash that we read at the beginning of the previous chapter a long time ago, that they taught that there was an order of time before the world was created. Pirush kedem brias ha'ilam hashafal. They mean before the creation of our lowly world. she'az ne'etzlu elam hanekudim shesham haya hashvira. Because before, so to speak, our low physical world was created, the world of nekudim, also known as tehu, which we've spoken about on many occasions now, was emanated, and that is where the shvira occurred. That is where the famous shviras hakelim, the breaking of the vessels, occurred. The short version of the story is that God's initial desire to be expressed with Svirus was in a much higher and more intense manner than the way in which he is expressed in Atzilus now. The initial expression was in the world of Tehu, which is also translated as a chaos. So when God initially wanted to express himself in the world, he expressed himself in the world of Tehu, in the world of chaos. But the world of chaos could not be sustained because it was chaotic. What does it mean? Was heißt chaotic? In the world of chaos, in the world of Tehu, each one of the 10 spheres was emanated in a way that it was the only possible sphere that could be. Right? Remember our discussion of the three worlds of the worlds before Atzilus. You had Akudim, where everything was united in one expression. Then you had Nekudim, which is Tehu, right? And only afterwards do you have Vrudim, which is Atzilus, as we know it. And if you'll recall, we discussed then the difference, but this process is the process by which the 10 spheres, the vessels of the 10 spheres, are created. And the important thing to remember for today's class is that it's a process, again, going from unity to division. So you had one expression of all the 10 spheres. In the end, in the world of Atzilus, you have an expression of 10 different spheres. And in the middle, you have the world of Nekudim, the world of Tehu, the world of chaos. And what was in chaos? There were 10 different spheres, but each one of them was emanated in the way that there's only one sphera. In other words, if you ask chesed, if you ask God's kindness in the world of Tehu, if it's possible for its opposite, if it's possible for gvura, if it's possible for severity to exist, God's kindness, that facet of his expression, would say no, there is no room for gvura. There is no room for severity at all. Everything is kindness. It's pure kindness, and there is no room for anything other than kindness. And the Gvura, which was emanated there, said the exact same thing. Gvura said there's no room for chesed. And essentially, especially the emotive spheres, it says, especially chesed and Gvura, not as much the intellectual ones, which is one of the reasons why intellect and emotions actually end up being different in the universe as God creates it. It's a whole other story. So long story short, it's unsustainable. The godly expression there is too high, so to speak. Each sphera thinks it's the one God, which is a mistake, because it's only one facet of his expression. And that is initially how he desired to be expressed, so to speak. That was unsustainable.
So he made a mistake?
No, that's not what I said. The whole thing...
No, it's an issue, It's been
not
discussed.
really. Yeah, it's been discussed, but I mean, it should be fairly obvious that the whole thing is planned in the first place, right? Just like the mistake of, we spoke about Noach's Ark at some point, and the regret that God has to destroy man, I believe, is a similar story, right? The simplest explanation for these things, if you don't want to get too complicated, is that of course God creates with the initial intention. He knows exactly what he's doing. There's no regrets. So it's actually important that there be, in other words, another way of saying that is, it's important there should be the world of chaos before there's the world of tikkun, even though that world is destroyed. So long story short, the world of tehu is unsustainable and it's destroyed. Something takes place called shviras hakelim. Essentially, there's too much light and not enough vessels. So the vessels, which remember, consist of the actual identity of the different spheres, what makes chesed chesed and what makes gvura gvura, are the vessels break. Which is very hard to understand. It's a very physical terminology for something that's not physical at all. But long story short, the world of Atzilus then emerges. And the world of Atzilus, also known as the world of Tikkun, is the world where everything is balanced. You have a lot of vessels and not a lot of light, which means that everything does not perceive itself as the one God, but rather everything perceives itself as part of something else. Really, this is the trait of Chachma, the trait of wisdom, which is why Atzilus is often referred to or reduced down simply to the sphere of Chachma, because Tikkun, everything works according to Chachma. Chachma, the highest form of intellect, is really a form of bittul, a form of nullification. True wisdom is to realize that you are nothing before the thing that is perceived. Is the definition of highest wisdom. And in fact, the process of really understanding something deeply necessitates that the person put themselves aside and be totally absorbed in the thing they're understanding. A Chachma is a form of bittul. And Tikkun, Atzilus, is really the world of Chachma. And there's a lot of vessels and only a little bit of light. In other words, it's a place that's defined, where their chesed is chesed and gvura is gvura, but God is not expressed there, so to speak, as powerfully as he was in Tohu, in the world of chaos. And Kabbalistically, the purpose of the world's creation, the purpose of history, right, is what you may have heard of as refining the sparks, right? To be mevarer the nitzutzes, to refine the godly sparks. The godly sparks are the vessels of Tohu that have fallen, quote unquote, into our reality. So the sparks of Tohu, in other words, there is an incredibly high expression of God that is within the world, but it's only implicit within it. It's not explicit within it. Explicitly, our world is created from Atzilus, and all other godliness is concealed. So there's a concealed godliness, an implicit godliness in our world from Tohu, from the world of chaos, from when the vessels broke. And the entire purpose of history, in a sense, according to Kabbalah, is to refine these sparks. Basically a process of straining out these sparks from our reality and returning them to their source, in which case the goal is that ultimately this, so to speak, grows the vessels of Atzilus. I don't have time to explain all of this. Growing the vessels of Atzilus eventually allows Atzilus to have both advantages. It will have the vessels of Atzilus and the sustainability and the balance of Atzilus, but it will have the light of Tohu. And this is accomplished by doing mitzvahs. That's the short class on Tohu and the breaking of the vessels. So all of this is really attached and related to our Maimer only in the sense that it talks about how Tohu existed before the world existed, right? It says, first of all, in the Chumash, it says that the land was chaos and the void before God created anything. It says right at the beginning of the Torah. And in Kabbalah, it's explained that the world of Tohu existed and then was destroyed, and the world of Atzilus, or the world as we know it, was created. So this has to do with the order of time that existed before the world. All of the Midrashim and all of the Torahs that talk about things that existed before the world existed are not talking about time in our understanding. They're not talking about even of the time of the Baal Shem Tov or the time of Rosh Hashanah, where 15 years can be seen at once or a whole year exists at once. This is actually talking about above time. It's talking about the order of time that is the source of time. And that's what we're going to discuss now. Kamasha Kosov.
So the order of time is before Bereshis, is that correct?
Correct. Assuming Bereshis talks about let's say so.
So that's the demarcation.
Yeah, let's say so. Fair enough.
And so there are really two histories. There's history before Bereshis.
Right.
And history post-Bereshis.
Right, but it's before time, so can it really be called a history is the question, right? It's not really in time, so it's something. It's some state of affairs that existed, before the creation of our world. Yes, correct.
All right, and just a footnote to the previous.
Yeah.
I was thinking that if you had a conversation between someone with great wisdom and someone who is a prophet, okay. The person who is the prophet might say, well, I have the advantage, I can do this.
Right.
I was trying to put your word advantage in context. And the person with great wisdom says, well, that may be true, but I can do that. My advantage is I can do that.
Correct.
And it's in that sense that it's almost a conversation between two persons,
Yeah.
sort of showing their cards, so to speak. So it's in that sense that the word advantage makes sense.
Yeah, sure. There you go. That's a logical context. So 377 on the second line. Let's just try to do a little more here. So the world of Nekudim, the world of Tohu, was emanated, and that's where there was a breaking of the vessels. Kamasha Kasav, as the sages said, Dein loy henian le. These did not bring me satisfaction, referring to the world that were before our world. Az hayakvar seder azmanim. There existed then, so how could there be something which existed and was destroyed before time was created? And the answer is, it has to do with the order of time, the source of time. Not within time as we understand it, but in the source of time. Seder azmanim. V'lo zman gomor, and not time, not complete or actual time as we perceive it. Ella, rather, there was an order of time, which means what? Atzilus eser spheres, the 10 spheres, the 10 modes of godly expression were emanated in order. Shemetchila nimshach chesed, first chesed was drawn forth, v'acher kach gvura, and then gvura was drawn forth, right? He says, and then, which is a time word. Right? We're saying we mean it in the sense of the order of time. First there was chesed, and then gvura was drawn forth afterwards. Hareza seder azman. This is the order of time. Ula achar kach, afterwards, bebiyah, in bria yitzira nasiya, in the lower worlds, nishav azman gomer. Actual time was created. V'liya is ki be'elam hazeh tzarich shefa elyona leschalek lechalakim rabim. And being that in this physical world, divine beneficence, the flow of divine expression, must be divided into many different parts, many different aspects or elements. Ad shemamida echad atzilus yishava elef shana kol kach? I think so. I think it's kol kach.
איפה כל כך? תתהווה 1,000 שנה כי תתחלק ל1,000 מדרגות.
You don't have a kol kach?
No, I have ki.
Interesting. I have a kol kach. Weird. Maybe it's a typo. I think it's a typo.
Yeah, ki makes sense.
Yeah, ki makes more sense. That explains why I didn't know what it meant. That one trait of Atzilus, from one trait of Atzilus, 1,000 years are created. From one svira of Atzilus, as we said before, 1,000 years eventually come about in our world. Ki tischalek le'elef madregus. That, because the sphere of Atzilus is divided into 1,000 levels. Shakol echad mischalek l'shasa bechinas, which each one of those 1,000 levels is further subdivided into 365 units. Shakol echad mischalek l'chafdal tzirufim, of which those 365 units, each one is divided into 24 tzirufim, 24 expressions of the name of the divine names. Shehem shois, which are hours. Shakol tziruf kadesh yishlabis chayusa be'elam hazeh, because each one of these forms, in order that its life force should become invested in this world, in order that it should inform our reality, mukhrach lischalek l'chalakim rabim kol kach ad sheyishava mehem meshech shah, must be divided into so many portions that an hour, a single hour, can be brought into being from them. Lefi kibbutz hatzimtzum b'shpastu shel kol chelek, according to the contraction and extension of each one of these godly forms, because if you'll remember, the source of all time is contraction and extension, mati v'lo mati, expression and non-expression, right? Moving towards its source and moving away from its source, all these different expressions. Sheshava zman rega, and then each portion is absolutely connected to the duration of a single moment. Let's do footnote 13, just because it has an interesting little point here. Yeah.
Does the time relate to the three ways that the spheres are being drawn within the Igulin? Chokhmah, Binah, and it expands. And you have Chesed, Chokhmah, Binah, all of those. And then you have the Etz Chaim, the Alachsonim.
I don't know anything about that. I'm not a Kabbalist. Footnote 13. On this basis, we can understand that the order of time refers to the array and sequence of the attributes in the spiritual realms. So in other words, the Rabbi Taber is just making a footnote here that it's not just that each moment has a source in the divine worlds, and that each hour has, so to speak, a less divided source, and each day a less divided source, and each year a less divided source, but rather that the sources of the divine energy actually characterize that time. As I mentioned before in one of our classes, that the time is actually characterized by a certain godly expression. Time is, if you have the ability to, if you have the tools to know, you would see that time is not really identical. Each moment is not identical to the next. Each one has a certain energy, has a certain spiritual source. As the Ritava continues, for the quality of each attribute defines the nature of the unit of time that comes into being because of it. For example, to cite Ramban's commentary on the Torah, on Bereshis chapter 2, verse 3, the first millennium of creation came from the attribute of chesed, from the attribute of kindness. Therefore, mankind was given abundant blessings as reflected in lifespans of close to 1,000 years, even though the people's conduct was decadent and they were not worthy. So in other words, the Ramban, who was a Kabbalist, he wrote a very Kabbalistic explanation of the Torah, explains that, as many commentators dwell on, the fact that in Bereshis the lengths of the lives were so long. Right? There's different explanations given, there's different understandings given. The Ramban says the lifespans were so long because they lived in the first millennium, which was the millennium of chesed, the millennium of kindness, and in that time, because there's so much divine blessing, people lived much longer lives, even though they didn't deserve it, which is a nice touch, because that's exactly the nature of chesed, of divine kindness. The nature of chesed is you get even if you don't deserve. It has nothing to do with whether you deserve or not, and that's the nature of kindness. No, it's the nature of chesed that you get even if you don't deserve it. It has nothing to do with whether you deserve or not. So.
Are you saying that a moment in time is a moment that has been suffused, really from potentially thousands of years of some number into that moment?
Not exactly.
It's sort of like from a single point, light expands.
It's the opposite. It's from 1,000 years. It divides into smaller. Yes, as it's created initially as 1,000 years. The 1,000 years are divided into smaller and smaller expressions, and we, from our perspective, are living within the succession at the most divided level, moment to moment. Rega to rega. That's the lowest level of the divine expression. It's interesting, as an aside, that the halachic rega is obviously not the smallest amount of time that can be measured. And obviously the Rebbeim know, and in fact it was the Tzemach Tzedek even mentioned it in the last chapter, that time can be divided into smaller and smaller parts, seemingly indefinitely. I mean, I think modern science has some sort of limit, but I don't think it's a technical limit having to do with light or particles. I can't remember. It's not like fundamentally you couldn't divide it further. It's just that nothing can take place, or no distance can be traveled in that small amount of time. I can't remember. It's called a Planck time. I don't know. You can Google it. So so even though time can be divided more or less infinitely, at least theoretically. The unit of the rega, which is the halachic unit, the smallest relevant halachic unit of time, if I'm not mistaken, is actually the smallest division of the divine flow of energy. So even though you can divide up the rega, right, because a rega I think is a 1,080th of an hour, if I'm not mistaken, maybe something like that. So the
daka is a low rega. Rega is a moment. Daka is a minute. It's two different things.
No.
Sha'ot zmaniyot. We're talking about sha'ot zmaniyot?
No, we're talking about time as it's defined in halacha. There's a minute, like when the Rambam talks about the Kiddush HaChedesh, right? There's hours and then there's moments. There's the hour and then there's the rega. I think chalakim, as it's called when we do the thing, right? So I think it's a 10/80th of an hour. A second is a 3600th, right? So it's actually longer than a second. It's closer to 2 seconds, something like that, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, so 3600th, yeah. So it's interesting because you could divide up the rega even more, but what we're saying is that the rega has its own individual divine energy, and the partsufim are not smaller than that. So that rega, even if you subdivide it, has the same energy. When energy switches, that marks the next.
What's the partsufim?
there's different partsufim of the different shemus, of the different names of Hashem, and different expressions of those different names. It's all Chachma. It talks about in Kabbalah, but I'm not a Kabbalist, so I don't know.
I don't relate to what you said about how I know about partsufim. Partsufim is combinations of spheres.
Yeah. Names is the same. Names and spheres are interchangeable. It's the same thing.
Okay.
Let me try to draw a visual. So, if we had a prism,
Yeah.
and you run light through a prism,
Yeah.
what happens?
It's divided up.
It
Yeah.
divides.
Mhm.
Okay. So now, when we talk about time, is it the same visual? I think what you said is that time is expansive. Does it run through the peephole, so to speak, and then expand again?
I don't think so. I think that what we're saying is that there's an initial divine expression, and the initial divine expression in the spheres are 1,000 years, and that gets further and further subdivided into smaller and smaller portions of time. So if you want to say that the 1,000 years is put through a prism and that is divided into parts, then I understand what you're saying. Otherwise, I am not certain. Okay, we will continue next week, God willing. We could actually, I think we are done. We could actually theoretically finish the mimer next week. It is possible, though not likely.
Of course, when I'm not here.
Of course. I arranged it that way specifically.
I'm not there.
When you talk about time